Thanks everyone for coming today and for dialing in. Today we have the next instalment in the Authors at Google series, and I'm very pleased to present Angela Saini. Angela is an award-winning science journalist who writes for New Scientist, Wired and GQ. She's also a regular reporter for the BBC, including the Digital Planet programme. Geek Nation is her first book. It's just been released to great reviews in Europe. It's coming out in Asia next week, and we just found out that it's gone to number 4 in the India bestsellers list today, even pre-release. So it's coming out in the US shortly, but if you didn't pick up a book on the way in, you can pick one up on Amazon or on Kindle. Angela's based in London, but she's flown in from New York to be with us today. So thank you very much for coming. Without further ado, Angela Saini.
This is a really small audience, but I'm cheered by the fact that millions of YouTube listeners will be watching it. Yes. My book launched a month ago, and I have done quite a few talks since then, but never to a very techie audience. So if this is way below your IQ level, please tell me, and I'll speed it up, and I'll find something more interesting to talk about. I didn't really know what to talk about. Geek Nation covers so many themes. Each chapter is a self-contained story in its own right, and there's an overarching narrative that goes on top of it. So it's very difficult to pick out stories and have them make sense, or pick out themes and have them make sense. But one of the things that people always say to me, especially if they've visited India or they've lived in India is such a poor country. How is it possible that this could be a nation of geeks? How can it be possible that you are calling it an aspiring scientific superpower? There's a huge paradox there. So that's what I want to talk about today, and I want to try and communicate to you this idea that even though India is poor and has high rates of illiteracy and poor education, it can still have the potential of entering the ranks of a scientific giant. And also at the same time, my book doesn't have any pictures in it, and people have said they would love to be able to see pictures of the places that I'm describing. So I'm going to give you a chance to have a look at some of the places that I talk about. There is this weird thing that India is this 11th largest economy, and yet it still has very high rates of illiteracy. So it actually has more illiterate adults than there are people in the US, which kind of puts that in perspective, while at the same time having this huge population of scientists and engineers. So I wanted to start by putting some kind of perspective for you on the culture of geekiness that I believe exists in India. So the picture on the slide right now is of Viswanathan Anand, who is an Indian chess champion, actually world chess champion. And India loves chess. It has this huge passion for chess. And so I want to start just by reading an extract from the beginning of the book in chapter 1, where I go to this chess tournament in Delhi, and I try to figure out why it is that Indians love chess so much. So the country is ranked 4th globally in the sport, and chess players insist it is a sport, above the United States, which is 9th. Which gives you some perspective on how brilliant India really is at chess. But there's something more unusual about this scene in the chess tournament. Generally, India is not a sporting nation. In fact, apart from cricket and a handful of other games, chess is a rare exception in a land that has one of the worst sporting records of anywhere in the world. Take the Olympics, for example. In the history of the modern games, the United States has won 2,549 medals. Great Britain has won 737 and China 429. Even the small Eastern European nation of Belarus has taken home 73. But you have to scroll almost to the bottom of the league tables to find India. It sits just above the desolate Central Asian Republic of Mongolia and just below Slovakia. In the whole of the Olympics history, India has won only 20 medals. Given the country's vast population, it's a mystery that's confused sports writers for decades. So a few years ago, 2 US researchers, Anirudh Krishna from the Sanford Institute of Public Policy at Duke University and Eric Hagland from the Congressional Hunger Center, decided to investigate. A country of more than 1 billion people like India, they calculated, should have won 157 medals at the 2004 Olympic Games. But of course, this fails to take into account that elite sports are expensive, ruling out millions of Indians who would never have a hope of becoming professional athletes. Wealth and size aren't the only things that determine Olympic success either. There's also the general level of education, people's health, and how close they live to sporting facilities. So the researchers crunched the numbers again. Taking into account the myriad factors that determine sporting success, they came up with a far more conservative estimate. India should have won around 14 medals at the 2004 Olympic Games, they said. Does anyone know how many they actually won? It was 1. And in fact, no other nation in their study had such a huge gap between its predicted medal count and the actual total. India did not and does not have a sporting culture, the veteran Indian sports columnist Rohit Brijnath explains to me frankly. Today, he works for the Straits Times newspaper in Singapore after the Indian sports magazine he was writing for closed down. Personally, one of the things that I always felt as a sports writer was a lack of drive among many athletes. I can't understand it. It is much better now, but earlier you only found that drive here and there, in exceptions like the great 400-metre runner of the 1960s, Milkha Singh, who used to boast that he trained so hard that he used to pee blood. My theory, and it's just mine, he adds, is that we're better suited to hand-eye sports, like shooting, or billiards, or archery, or thinking sports, like chess. I turned to Radhesham Tiwari, a 64-year-old international arbiter for the World Chess Association, for his opinion. He's been playing this game for 40 years. Watching the players on the table next to us, he ponders the question for a while. Indians, well, basically, they have a good liking for brainy games, he announces at last, rolling each R with his tongue. Yes, and we are good at brainy things, he continues. Brain makes us supreme. That kind of sums up the attitude that Indians have to science and technology and academic pursuits. This idea that sport, physical sport, isn't really necessary in order to move the nation forward, even though it might be a nice indicator of a kind of show of how much of a superpower a country is. But what really will take them forward is academic games, chess, and if you look at the Olympiads, which, unlike the Olympics, are a kind of academic contest that happen around the world among students, India actually does really well. It's one of the champions in that. So one of the things I wanted to figure out when I wrote Geek Nation was, where does this apparent love of brainy games come from? Why India, and why Asia as well? India actually has a very long scientific history. I'm just going to give you a really quick overview now. India has a very long scientific history, as well as having some of the world's leading philosophers 2,000, 1,000 years ago. It was the place where the zero was invented, which you guys will probably know is a linchpin of modern mathematics. It's very important to modern maths. It was also a big centre of philosophy. The picture on the screen right now is of the Bakshali manuscript, which is the oldest scientific text ever found in Asia. And it was found in a farm in what is now Pakistan, but obviously used to be India once. I spent a really long time when I was there trying to dig behind the history. There's not that much of it in the book, but just out of personal interest, I really wanted to figure out where are these texts and where do they lie. A lot of them have been destroyed over the years. And the Bakshali manuscript, oddly, turned out not to be in India anymore at all. 100 years ago, it was moved to Oxford, which is where I studied. So I had to go back to the UK in order to see it. And very kindly, the library at my old college let me in and let me see the manuscript. It's beautiful. What you can see here is exactly what it looks like, this kind of faded palm leaf manuscript, a little shred, but you can see, not so much on this one, but on the shred that I saw, you can see numbers in columns and little groupings everywhere and different signs, which just goes to show that before the West had even encountered these quite sophisticated mathematical ideas and scientific ideas. Countries like India and China already had them. The problem was, just like the Bakhshali manuscript, they all moved west and they didn't stay in the East, and the East didn't really take advantage of them like they could have, and science and technology instead rose in the West, which is why we have the situation that we have now. India never went through an enlightenment like Europe did. It never went through a renaissance like Europe did. And it wasn't India that took advantage of advances, those early advances in science and tech. It was a royal society in London that was one of the places that became the arena for the development of modern science as we understand it today. So this idea that you can make a hypothesis, test it empirically, and then subject it to peer review, which is what we think of science now. That was not what science looked like 1,000, 2,000 years ago. So India kind of exists in this strange scientific limbo because it hasn't completely separated these ideas of the past with modern science. It is remarkable of pseudoscience and astrology and homeopathy and ideas that in the West we've ditched to some extent, or at least we don't treat them like we treat modern science. In India, they sit almost side by side. So, for example, I went to the Indian Science Congress last year in January, which is the biggest scientific meeting in India. The Prime Minister comes, lots of ministers. And in the exhibition hall, there were pamphlets on Vedic science, and the Vedic science is a type of religious, Hindu religious science, and astrology, and there were panels on homeopathy. So there is this, it does exist in this strange limbo, and it's been difficult to get out of it because that Renaissance period never happened, but they have tried. So now I want to go much forward in time, back about 60 years, when India became independent from the British. So India's first prime minister after the country became independent from the British in 1947 was Jawaharlal Neru. And these days, we always think of Neru as this kind of charismatic, cool leader who was a bit of a ladies' man and built this entire nation from scratch after the British left India. But he was also a geek in his own right. He studied natural sciences at Cambridge, and when he became Prime Minister of India, he had seen what had happened in the US and he'd seen what had happened in the Soviet Union, and said to himself, I want a part of that for India. Science and technology is the way we are going to grow this country, and we have to do it not just by investing in science and tech, but also by making the population more rational. So it was almost a call to enlightenment. Not quite, because it was many hundreds of years later, but his legacy was so huge that if you look at the Indian constitution now, it says on the slide, one of the fundamental duties of an Indian citizen is to develop the scientific temper, humanism, and the spirit of inquiry and reform, which is unique in constitutions around the world. We can't even imagine that now, that all those decades ago, Indian leaders would have looked at the country and said, this is a birthplace of 4 major world religions, a very spiritual nation, yet we have to make the country more rational and logical in the way it thinks. Even if you're not a scientist in your everyday life, we want you to be more logical. So Nehru carried this kind of legacy forward, and it was a baton that was picked up by subsequent leaders, every single one. So he founded these huge Indian institutes of technology, which today many of the people who graduated from there in the 1970s and 1980s have come to Silicon Valley and San Francisco, have set up huge firms. So Sun Microsystems, for example, was founded by Vinod Khosla, who is an IIT graduate. Many of India's IT leaders and politicians, technocrats, are IIT graduates. He also founded nuclear power stations, hydroelectric dams. He invested in labs and research facilities. So he really laid or helped lay the foundation for what we now think of as more of a nation of geeks. But then the question is, given this kind of geeky culture that exists, and given this investment on the government side, into science and technology. What exactly today are we seeing in terms of results? So how far is India really at becoming a scientific superpower? That was a big question for me. I'm a science journalist. I work mainly in the UK, and I was skeptical when I went to India because a lot of people had said to me, you won't even find enough examples of original Indian science to fill your book. There's not that much going on there. So one of the first things I did when I landed in New Delhi, that was in the winter of 2009, was I knew the first thing had to be that I had to visit one of these Indian institutes of technology to see what they're like on the inside. Are they really these hotbeds of exciting innovation, or are they just perpetuating the stereotype that Indian engineers are kind of geeky, drone-like, and a bit boring and dull? So the picture on the slide here is inside the Geek Factory, the Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi. The photographs that you're going to see now, the next 3 slides, were taken by Tom Parker, who is a Condé Nast photographer. I did a piece for GQ at the same time as visiting the IIT, and these are the pictures that he took. And they're a perfect glimpse into how these places look. This especially, it's a dusty window or a board where a guy is writing on, and you can see a kind of shabby lecture theatre in the background. And that's exactly what this place is like. They're really shabby. I was kind of disappointed at turning up to this, what is meant to be the most elite engineering college in the whole of India. And it didn't have air conditioning in most of the lecture theatres, which meant that in the summer, these kids boil to death, and yet they still have to turn up to lectures. And worse than that, worse than the shabbiness and the old-fashioned lecture theatres and the lack of air conditioning, there really didn't seem to be, on the surface at least, any kind of spirit of creativity. I mean, I studied engineering, and when I was there, one of my classmates built a computer in his spare time. When I was a kid, I used to build model rockets, and, engineers are natural tinkerers, and there didn't seem to be this quality among the young Indian engineers that I was meeting at the Indian Institute of Technology. And that kind of disappointed me, although it did reinforce the stereotype and it did confirm it. So I tried to figure out, why is it? Why is it that these kids choose to do engineering and yet they don't seem to have a passion for it? And part of the reason is that the education system is so competitive. So in 2009, almost 500,000 Indian students sat the engineering college entrance exams, and only 10,000 of them got a place, which just goes to show that's harder to get into than Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge, any of the big universities in the West, which just goes to show how difficult and competitive these places are. And so in order to win a place like that, in order to pass the exams, these kids spend every evening and every weekend in coaching classes. So almost all the students at this Indian Institute of Technology will have been coached almost entirely through their teenage years. And by the time they get to college, they're burnt out, understandably. That passion has been sucked out of them, if you like. They're literally spending their childhoods cramming for these exams. The picture on the slide right now is of a kid called Nishant Ranka. He's 22 years old, an engineering student. And he said to me, when I went to the UK and saw people shut their shops at 5 o'clock, I couldn't understand it. Here they're open late into the night. Indians work a lot harder than Europeans and Americans. And he told me that he was coached, before he came to college, for 3 hours a day, as well as the 9 hours he would study anyway at school to make sure he passed the exams. And the pressure is so immense that the National Crime Records Bureau, which keeps a check of suicides, the suicide rate across India, in 2008, which is their most recent figure, more than 2,000 students across India committed suicide because of the pressure of exams and the fear that they would fail. So the growth in IT has led to the demand for engineers, has led to thousands more kids wanting to go to college to study engineering, but has also led, in turn, to this kind of innovation is stifled because of the competition and because it's so difficult to get into these places. But that is changing. And it was only after spending many weeks there that I noticed how these tiny little shoots of innovation are coming up now. So the next slide is still inside the Indian Institute of Technology. In 1991, so when Neru became Prime Minister of India, he was very much a socialist. He believed that India had to be self-sufficient, it had to do everything itself. He didn't believe in foreign imports, not only of objects, but also ideas. In 1991, that began to change. India liberalized its economy. I'm sorry, this is a really potted history. It's really quick, and I hope you're keeping up with it. But so in 1991, the economy liberalized. MTV came in, Coca-Cola came in, but also with that was this kind of influx of new ideas, foreign ideas. It was easier to travel. Everybody saw more of the world. And this new generation came up. A guy at Tata Consultancy Services, which is one of India's big 3 IT firms, called it Generation Y. So not Generation XY, but Generation WHY. The first generation post-liberalization who were willing to question and not just do rote learning or not just cram for exams, but think outside the box a bit. And at the IIT in Delhi, I wanted to find evidence of that. And luckily, fortunately, I did. It's beneath the surface and it's only just beginning to happen now, which makes sense if you think about it, because the 22-year-olds of now are the ones who have grown up in this post-liberalization age, post-1991. So the student in the slide right now took part in a contest called the Robocon, which is a big pan-Asian event where students have to come together and build a robot that can do one specific human task. So things like this are happening. There's also this new group on campus called Technocracy, which in their spare time, they're learning things like MATLAB, which is an engineering programming language. They're learning to build microprocessors. So those tiny creative shoots are coming up right now. It's very small. And in the 6 months that I spent researching this book, I did find tiny examples of this innovation happening all over India. But it's very small and it's very much at the beginning of a revolution, if you like. And I think the reason we still carry the stereotype that we do about Indian engineers reminds me a lot of how we saw Japan in the 1960s and 70s, that here is this country that is really good at copying what other people are doing, but not so good at coming up with its own ideas. And India is in that state now, but just crossing the line in the same way that Japan did. So these kids who are now graduating, who have only lived in a liberalized India, are going to be the ones that think outside the box and create this new innovative society, the kind of society that you have in San Francisco and the Silicon Valley, that is truly scientific and creative. So what are they actually achieving in scientific terms? Now, given that this generation hasn't completely come of age yet, it's a bit difficult. But one example that I talk about in the book is tuberculosis. So research in tuberculosis is quite widespread in India. It's a disease that kills 2 Indians every 3 minutes. So it's incredibly deadly, incredibly contagious. In the West, we haven't heard of it so much, or it's not so prevalent, just because it's almost been eradicated here. And it is a function of poverty, it's a function of poor health and poor diet and low immunity. And in India, it's a huge problem. The picture on the slide right now is of a tuberculosis clinic in Mumbai, and a poor guy having his chest examined by a doctor. Now, I didn't go to Mumbai, I actually went to Chennai to visit some TB hospitals. And Chennai, if you don't know already, is India's medical capital. It's so great at medicine. It has some of the best hospitals in the world. So good, in fact, that medical tourists go from the West to have their hips replaced and kidneys replaced there at rock-bottom prices, and they can stay in a fancy hotel while they're doing it. But of course, that's not where the poor go. The poor end up in places like this, and they're the majority. So here is a deadly disease killing millions of Indians and millions in the developing world. Western pharmaceutical companies haven't come up with a cure for TB in 40 years, a new treatment in 40 years, which means that if you have TB, you need to take a cocktail of drugs for 6 months in order to fix it. And even then, you're not guaranteed of not being contagious. And while you are contagious, the chances are you will infect many dozens of people around you. So the reason that big pharma don't invest in TB is, like I said, it's not a disease prevalent in the West. There's not that much money for it. But in India, what they're doing is all these disparate researchers with a very small amount of resources and in very ramshackle labs are trying to work on it. So I visited one researcher, for example, in Chennai, who has a lab that's so unbiosafe, has such poor resources that you can't even work on the TB bacterium itself because it's too dangerous. She has to work on E. coli, which is the closest to TB that she can get, and do studies on safely for her team. So what's the solution? Given that you have all these poor but willing researchers all over India working on this drug, on this bug, and trying to come up with a solution, and yet they don't have the resources of big pharma. And this is what may be the solution. It's the open source drug discovery project, and it's run out of Delhi. It's the government funds it. The Indian government funds it partly with when you compare to how much it would cost big pharma to produce a drug for TB, a fraction of the cost. And what they're essentially doing, they call it Science 2.0. And what they're essentially doing is collecting all the TB research from all over the country and putting it online and trying to make sense of it in a way that might help lead to a TB drug later down the line. One of the things that they're trying to do is annotate the TB genome. And if anyone knows, this is a long process. It's basically explaining how the TB genome works and how it's built. And it can take many months to do it. But given that they had all these researchers, disparate researchers, the OSDD team got together and said, how about if we ask Indian students to each take a small section of the genome and annotate it? So that's what they did. They got thousands of students from all over the country. Obviously, postgrad and qualified students, because it's not an easy, it's a specialized job. And yet, because of India's vast geeky manpower, they can do this. And they got them all together, and within a few months, they had annotated the genome, which is incredibly quick. They still have to verify it and check it and make sure that it's all fine. But as a model for doing very fast biology, it's incredibly efficient. And companies have been so excited about it that one Indian IT company, Infosys, has offered to give their expertise for free. So they're offering to design a semantic web platform where all this research can be made sense of so that they can use it to develop a new drug. And they're fairly confident they will develop a new drug out of it. So when I met the team, which was last spring, 2,700 people in India and overseas has registered to be part of the group. And when I was writing up the chapter, from 53 different countries, when I was writing up the chapter a few months later, that had gone up to 3,800 in 93 countries. So if you look at this, India is a poor country, and yet, in an innovative way, it's overcoming the fact that it has resource shortfalls by taking advantage of its huge geeky manpower and coming up with alternatives. This is completely antithetical to the way science works. Science, especially pharmaceutical science, is about credit. It's about keeping research maintained within a small company or a small group so that you can make sure that you own it at the end. And yet, these thousands of scientists are willing to give up their credit or share their credit, dilute it, and work together in order to come up to a solution to a problem like this. Science isn't done this way, and it's interesting, and I think it shows a measure of innovation in India that they came up with a solution like this and that it is working. And it's not just pharmaceuticals or obvious areas like biological research or medicine where things like this are happening. the government, in the vein of Neru's vision for India to be a more scientific society, are also trying to harness that geeky manpower to improve the country as a whole. And to illustrate that, I want to read another extract from the book. This is the last one. It's from a chapter called Geeks Rule, and it's about a city being built in the Western Ghats. So there's a picture of the Western Ghats behind me. This is an enormous range of hills, just a few hours' drive from Pune. That's the nearest city, but quite isolated. Very few people live there. So the ground beneath our feet is always moving. 200 million years ago, South America, Africa, India, Australia, and Antarctica weren't where they are now, but were part of one enormous supercontinent that spanned the hemisphere. The split happened around 30 million years later, after which they gradually drifted into the positions they occupy today. When this violent breakup happened, gigantic volcanic ranges burst through the crust, while vast new oceans filled the gaps that the shifting continents left behind. The Earth looked like a pie that had been torn into slices. At its edges, the land buckled and creased. In the north of India, the Himalayas were created, and when India's west coast finally broke free from the island of Madagascar, another one of these geological creases became the Western Ghats. Today, this 1,600-kilometre stretch of high hills, blanketed in forests, is one of the most remote places in the world. There are at least 5,000 different types of flowers. Elephants, snakes, tigers, and cave bats all live here, secluded from the rest of India. Zoologists who have occasionally ventured into the Ghats have found new species by the handful. One time, they discovered a dozen multicoloured types of frog, a species that was thought to have been extinct for a century. The mountainous territory is inhospitable. The second I cross into it, civilization disappears. It's eerily silent in every direction, save a cry from the odd macaque. And yet here, in the middle of the Western Ghats, in what can reasonably be called nowhere, I descend into a steep valley and find myself in one of the most advanced cities on Earth. I arrive in the evening, just in time to catch dinner at one of the first restaurants in this half-built metropolis. It's an American-style diner, and I'm their only customer. There are pictures of Lucille Ball and Betty Boop on the walls, and the floor is covered in black and white checkerboard tiles. When they bring my food, they slide bottles of French's yellow mustard and Heinz tomato ketchup onto the countertop of my red leather booth. This could be New York in the 1950s. But this isn't the Twilight Zone. This is the city of Lavasa. I first read about it in an advertisement in an in-flight magazine and became intrigued by what the advert claimed will be a metropolis governed mainly by machines. A bank of centralized computers, I read, will control everything here, from household security to the transport network. It's a $500 million project to build from scratch an urban dream in the middle of the mountains. Even the roads leading here have had to be carved out of the hills. It's the biggest thing to happen to the Western Ghats since the Cretaceous period. So you can imagine how weird it was for me to turn up, to drive for 2 hours in the night, and then turn up in the middle of a hill and be eating omelettes in an American diner with pitch black all around me and nobody there because the workers have gone home and nobody has moved into this city yet. So the interesting thing about this place, like I said, is that it will be electronically governed. That's the aim. It's completely being built from scratch. So what they've done is during the construction, they've mapped everything in layers. So everything from the water pipes to where the houses are, the foundations, the broadband, everything has been designed so that if there's a fault, they'll know exactly where it is and they can go and fix it immediately. And every house and apartment in this complex, and I'll show you the complex here. This is a picture of the promenade at Lavasa. The American diner is near the end. This is the only bit that was actually complete when I got there. So you can imagine just this and then hills all around it. Every apartment in there will have a kiosk where even if you don't have access to the internet or your own computer, you'll be able to use this kiosk to pay all your bills, make complaints if you have to, communicate with other residents. It's an intranet for the entire city. And what the temporary manager told me, they're going to elect a mayor once the city gets running, but what the temporary manager told me was that this city will, the aim is to have as few people running it as possible. Essentially, it will run itself. The geeks will rule, or the technology will rule. But then again, this is a private development. It's really expensive to stay here. The houses have almost all been sold now, I think, but the population is capped at 300,000, and if you want to live there, then you have to pay a high price. So a lot of the people who have bought houses, I understand, are actors and actresses and, IT moguls and stuff. But the principles that you can see here are being rolled out across the whole of India by the Indian government. So exactly the same kind of thing is happening all over the country. If you've ever been to India, you'll know that it has very high levels of corruption and an incredibly frustrating bureaucracy. It holds up everything. It actually cuts to the heart of how scientists work, because the corruption even travels as far as the university level. So professors will get promoted because nepotism sometimes rather than actual merit. So in order for India to be a smoother society, in order for it to be any kind of superpower, let alone scientific one, it needs to solve this problem of a weak bureaucracy and corruption. And of course, because it is a nation of geeks, I think, they're digitizing everything, and that's their way of doing it. Geek government, just like in Lavasa. So since the early 1990s, there have been these huge state-run attempts to move government records online. This has happened all over the world, for sure. In India, though, it's happening in such a huge way, in a way that stunned even me. So things like land records, birth certificates, death certificates, are all going online, and it means you can access them more easily. And this is where it's being masterminded. So the picture on the screen right now is of Electronics which is the IT ministry of India in Delhi. Electronics mean electronics house. So it's literally electronics house. I'm not a big fan of Indian government ministries. Every time I've gone to one, it's been really frustrating. You turn up, usually they're not there, or they knock off at like 3:00, so you miss them. Huge lunch breaks. I went to the health ministry many years ago to do a story, and while I was there waiting for an official, who, by the way, gave me no useful information, I got bitten by a poisonous spider on my foot, and my foot swelled up like a sweet potato, which is ironic given that it was a health ministry. So I was kind of scared. I was worried about going to this building, and I left with plenty of time, early appointment, to make sure that they would see me. And it surprised me because it was like no ministry I'd ever been to. I was shown in immediately. This place is run like a well-oiled machine. The second I got there, I was told that most of the people working there, or at least in the unit that I was seeing, actually came from the private sector. So they've worked in the Indian IT industry, and now they wanted to help the government make the country more streamlined and help the bureaucracy, which is why they'd gone to work in this place. And it was incredible. They answered all my questions straight away. So one of the things they're doing in this building is monitoring projects like Lavasa, but also other examples of electronic governance all over the country being run on the state level, to see where the best practice is. And what they've come up with is a scheme very much like in the houses of Lavasa, you'll have those kiosks. They're introducing kiosks like that at the block level all across India. So a block is about 5 or 6 villages, half a dozen villages. So every block will have a kiosk operated by, in some states, by women. It takes very little skill to be able to operate a kiosk like that. And you'll be able to pay all your bills there, everything. So I visited, they're around, I think, halfway through this scheme. And at the moment, they're trying to get it into the very furthest reaches. So there are some islands and there are some states in the northeast that are very remote and inhospitable. So they're working on that right now. But I went to visit one of these kiosks in Jaipur, which is a city in Rajasthan on the tourist trail. And I was a bit skeptical because I've grown up in Britain where IT projects always seem doomed to failure. They never work. And they cost millions of pounds, and yet they never work. And I got to this kiosk. It was a Sunday, and I expected there to be huge queues, or if not huge queues, then nobody using it, and really bad records. And it turned out that already that Sunday, hundreds of people across the state had already used the kiosks near them to pay their bills. I saw one guy paying 3 different bills, so a power bill, a mobile bill, and a landline bill, I think it was, in minutes. And you can't do that. You can't even do that in Britain. You can't go to one place and pay all your bills in one place. So it was quite incredible what they'd managed to achieve. There aren't that many stats about how efficient this program is yet because it's very early days. But in 2008, the Ministry of IT here did a survey that found that 5 out of the 10 states that had computerized their land records by 2008, so that's just land records, which are the most contentious documents in India, by the way. Many civil court suits are about land records. Bribes in those states had either reduced significantly or been completely eliminated. Now, when you take into account that, according to Transparency International, all the households below the poverty line in India, so these are poor households in India, together pay more than $200 million in bribes every year. The potential for that is huge. If it works, then it's huge. And I'm not saying that it will work, but it's exciting that India is taking those steps and making those advances and making the investment to make it work. The thing that's making it work, of course, is that it has the geeky manpower. It's built up an expertise in doing Western IT outsourcing projects to other governments, learnt those lessons and brought them back, and are now having those same people run the projects for themselves. So I'm nearly done. The final thought I just want to leave you with is that while India might not, if you look at the stats, if you look at the facts and figures, while it may not be making a huge impact on scientific output at the moment, I think India's proportion of scientific output is something, as a share of the globes, is something like 3% at the moment. So not incredibly encouraging. It is on the cusp of this revolution that's happening. They're trying to solve the problems, the underlying problems that will help the country become a scientific superpower in the future. They're creating this legion of geeks that are going to help move that forward. And I really think this is what will give India its edge in the next 10 or 20 years. So if you look at scientific publications, yes, India is very low down. But when you think that Japan, Germany, Britain and France have become steadily less productive since 2000 as a share of the world's output, if you look at the graph, India's output has risen every single year, like China's, although not at the same rate as China's. In 2008, it published 53% more scientific papers than on average in each of the 5 years that went before. So it's ramping up its investment quite incredibly. The biggest difference, I think, will be made by the fact that the Indian government is planning to ramp up its proportion of GDP spending on R&D. So if you look at developed countries and developing countries, developed countries tend to spend around 2% of GDP on R&D. So that includes, Japan actually spends a lot more than that. US spends about that. UK spends about that. Whereas countries like Brazil and China and South Africa, China is increasing, but Brazil and South Africa and India tend to spend around 1%. The government has made a commitment to enter that 2% category. I can't say when that will happen. They were hoping it would happen by next year. That's unlikely, but it will happen soon. The picture on the slide is of Manmohan Singh doing a V sign, but I chose it because it was a 2%. Although I'm sure that's not what he meant when he did that. He announced last year, actually, that 2012 would be India's year of science, which is great for the book, but I think also great for India. So finally, this is a very almost final slide. I love space rockets, and it doesn't really serve a purpose, but I wanted to show you 2 pictures of space rockets quickly. The first is I went to the Indian Space Research Organisation in the book, and I saw a rocket launch in South India, which was just incredible. Not of a rocket this scale, but the first is a polar satellite launch vehicle, which is what carried India's first lunar probe a couple of years ago, which was a pretty good success. And India's plan now is to send their first astronaut into space in 2015, which is something, in terms of individual nations, only 3 nations have done, as China, US, and the Soviet Union. And that astronaut, or those astronauts, will go up in a rocket something like this, which is a geosynchronous satellite launch vehicle. It'll probably be a bit bigger than that. So they're working on that now, working on the technology, not just the rocket technology, but also making these things habitable, which is actually a huge scientific challenge. And I think this demonstrates, in terms of space especially, demonstrate in India's raw ambition when it comes to science. And that even though people might look at India and say, why is this poor country investing so much in science and tech? It is playing the long game. It is thinking about the far, far future. And that's it. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yep. Oh, yeah, we need the microphone for the question.
Thank you for coming. I had a couple questions sort of related to if there's any signs of resistance or pushback to this movement. For example, when you were speaking of Lavasa and the sort of widespread e-government proposals and so forth, I think that's fantastic. I think that's wonderful to make people's lives more efficient and so forth. But I'm also thinking there's somebody out there thinking, wow, that's a bureaucrat that's not getting paid. Those are bribes I'm not getting. And, I should, if I can, derail this as soon as possible. So there's an economic reason for pushback. And the other is sort of a more cultural one. And you can sort of see that here in the United States, where there's sort of the haves and the have-nots of technological progress and so forth. And that has caused something of a religious resurgence here in the United States and other places. And, obviously, as you mentioned, India already has this, great, impressive, religious history. And so, so one question is, is this revolution going to be equally distributed, both geographically, politically, and culturally and so forth? And then again, sort of a general question about have you seen any signs of pushback sort of on these movement forward?
I actually, about a third of the book is about the resistance from religious groups and activists. There are many activists in India who believe that the country, like Mahatma Gandhi dreamed of it, would always be this nation of farmers, that it would always be a largely agricultural place, which is completely at odds with this idea that it should industrialize and that it should become this nation of geeks. And for them, it will always be a nation of farmers, I think. That resistance does exist. In terms of the bribes, the people who take the bribes, I think would be quite stupid to then say, no, we want our bribes, please don't do this. That would be quite odd. But I'm sure that there are, even in these big bureaucratic IT projects, people skimming off the top, because that's the nature of in places like this. And I'm sure that's the nature in big IT projects all over the world, that there's always someone skimming off the top. But at the same time, if it increases transparency, which is what it's doing, and if it reduces corruption and bureaucracy, because it reduces that distance between the person and the government, and the modes for those people to come in and become middlemen, which they had before, and because of the internet can't, then I think it will at least go some way to solving that problem, for sure. What was your other question? Was there another question? Can't remember. There are, So in the book, I do give example. The example I use in the book is of the debate over GM food. So in the US, GM food is very widely grown. In Europe, there's a huge resistance to it. And in India, it's kind of half and half. So they grow BT cotton at the moment, which is a resistance to bollworm. And they're trying to introduce their first BT food crop, which is an aubergine, brinjal, eggplant. and there's been huge resistance to it, partly because of activists, partly because of the way it's been done, and it's thought to have been controlled by commercial interests. So whenever a new technology comes in, I think people feel a bit reluctant about it. But India, and I think a lot of Asia actually, is surprisingly excited about the new. So I gave a talk in New York the other day, and there was someone from South Korea in the audience, and all the way through they were nodding furiously. They were like, yeah, my parents made me play chess as well, and it's exactly like that in Korea. And there is, in the West, or at least in Britain where I've grown up, there is this kind of skepticism and fear of new things and technology, whereas in India, not so much. I think people embrace it, which is exciting.
How are the graduate research universities doing? You mentioned the faculty. Are the research faculty improving, and is India doing anything to help that? Certainly the undergraduates coming out of there are fantastic, but most of the top students don't go to there for their PhDs.
No, they don't. When I went to the Indian Institute of Technology, they complained, the dean was complaining that very few students stay on to do PhDs, and certainly none of the good ones, because they can earn these huge, massive salaries working for IT companies and multinationals. So there's just no incentive for them to do that, especially since India is not known for research. So even if you did stay on, the facilities are so poor and the resources are so poor that you couldn't really make a mark. But that is changing. So, for example, at IIT Delhi, they're introducing programs now which will help you get funding, if not from the government or from the college and from private sources, and providing these kind of incentives for students to stay on and do PhDs. I really hope that happens, because that's what you need to build a truly scientific country. And that's where India has suffered, that all these great undergraduates go to the US and do their PhDs here and contribute to America's scientific society, and not to India's. But I'm convinced that will change. Are we done?
Any questions on the VC just before we wrap up? No? Okay, thanks everyone. Thanks very much, Angela, for coming.
Thank you.